This year marks the 75th anniversary of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's Four Freedoms speech, the core part of his State of the Union on January 6, 1941. And we are joined by the director of the FDR Presidential Library and Museum, Paul Sparrow. What was the Four Freedoms speech, Paul?
Well, it was really an opportunity for him to try to explain why America should care about the war that was raging in Europe and the war that was raging in the East, in Asia. And it was a way for him to try to look at the future and say, what are we going to be fighting for? The four freedoms: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. He felt these are the things that define the difference between democracy and the dictatorships that were at that point running rampant throughout the world. And the American public at that point was still fairly isolationist. They didn't want to get involved in the European war. They were still angry about the fact that they hadn't been repaid for the loans from World War I. And so Roosevelt was trying to help them understand that it was a global world, it was a global village, and that the things that were happening overseas directly affected them and would impact their ability to enjoy these freedoms that were so vital to American democracy.
It's called the Four Freedoms speech. It's really part of that January 6th State of the Union speech. What was the reaction by Congress and the rest of the American public to that speech?
Well, it's interesting. There was a little bit of a delayed reaction. I mean, at first, there were some critics who sort of panned the speech. And of course, it really is only the last 2.5 minutes of a speech that ran over 30 minutes long, where in the first part of the speech is a fairly traditional, back then it was called the annual address to Congress, but it was a fairly traditional State of the Union address. Well, here's what I've done, here's what's going on in the world. But what happened is that those four freedoms really gained momentum over time and became a really central rallying cry. Obviously, Norman Rockwell created the four paintings several years later, which went on to raise $180 million in war bonds, traveled the world. They became, of course, very famous. It generated a park, Four Freedoms Park on Roosevelt Island in New York. There's a Four Freedoms Awards. Now they're given every year, international awards. So it really created the foundation for what the world came to think of as these essential freedoms. And, of course, it motivated Eleanor Roosevelt when she was drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for the United Nations, and in many ways formed the foundation of that seminal document in the post-war world.
Your website at the FDR Library and Museum mentions that the FDR went through some 7 drafts of this. How do you think, what was his inspiration, FDR's inspiration for these four freedoms? Where did he find that?
Well, I think, the core inspiration obviously was the First Amendment. I think he understood the power of the First Amendment. But the First Amendment, in addition to speech and religion, and it has, assembly and petition and things that were a little hard for people to understand in the contemporary society. So he wanted to draw from the strength of the First Amendment this idea that the government cannot interfere with these core freedoms. But he wanted to expand that so that the idea was that you had this freedom from want, that people shouldn't starve to death, that the government has some responsibility to take care of their people, and freedom from fear, in the sense that governments should not be able to just invade neighboring countries, that there should be a sense of sovereignty and that people should be able to live in a safe and secure world. And this was the underpinnings of his whole philosophy about peace, about global peace, and why he felt so strongly about creating the United Nations, that only when you had a consortium of countries working together could you prevent the kind of horror that they had experienced in World War I, and that was now unfolding in Asia and Europe.
Well, flash forward 75 years to 2016. How do you think that concept, the Four Freedoms speech, fits into today's world and today's political climate here in the U.S.?
Well, it's quite extraordinary. I mean, almost everything that the Roosevelts fought for 75 years ago is relevant today. It's on the front pages of the newspapers. It leads our television shows. This idea of religious intolerance is driving much of the violence we see in the Middle East. This idea of the freedom of speech and expression is underpinning all of the issues where you have totalitarian governments still trying to repress the rights of their people to speak. Even in China just very recently, they changed the laws to make it even harder for bloggers and people to comment online. Obviously, this freedom from want is critical. We've seen a fairly dramatic increase in the quality of life across the world. There are fewer people living in abject poverty today than at any point in recorded human history. So there has been progress made in that. But I think if you think about freedom from fear, Americans right now are being inundated with these messages of fear, with these messages that we are in danger. In fact, it's a safer world now than it has ever been. But there are these terrorist organizations out there that are inflicting terror, and the way media operates today, relatively small events take on global significance. If you think about, in 1941, more than 1 million people were killed by the Nazis. The level of physical violence, the level of death and destruction that was happening then was so much greater than we're experiencing today, and yet the fear factor today is extremely high. So I think the idea of creating a world in which people are free from fear, then you would eliminate things like the Syrian refugee crisis. If people felt like they could stay in their homes and they would be protected regardless of their religion, they would have an opportunity to earn a living and to protect their families, then you wouldn't be seeing, the greatest refugee crisis since the end of World War II.
Paul Sparrow is director of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
And up next, here's a look at that For Freedom speech, part of the January 6, 1941 State of the Union address.
The first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want, which translated into world terms means economic understandings which will secure to every nation a healthy, peacetime life for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. The fourth is freedom from fear, which translated into world terms means a worldwide reduction of armaments to such a point and in such a thorough fashion that no nation will be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbor anywhere in the world. This nation has placed its destiny in the hands and heads and hearts of its millions of free men and women, and its faith in freedom under the guidance of God. Freedom means the supremacy of human rights everywhere. Our support goes to those who struggle to gain those rights and keep them. Our strength is our unity of purpose to that high concept. There can be no end save victory.